The sun had barely risen over the sprawling city of Rivertown, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. Ethan Thomas, a 32-year-old construction worker, had no idea that this morning would be different from any other. He stepped out of his small apartment, his mind preoccupied with the usual mundane thoughts: work, groceries, maybe even catching a few hours of sleep later. Little did he know that the city he called home was about to transform into a nightmare he could never have imagined. By 9 a.m., the first signs of chaos had already begun. At first, it was a distant noise, loud, frantic, like something was happening just outside the city's boundaries. Ethan didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another traffic jam or maybe an accident. However, by noon, things had taken a turn for the worse. On his lunch break, as Ethan grabbed a quick sandwich at a local deli, the air was thick with tension. News broadcasts on the television in the corner of the shop showed images of violent riots in the streets. People were screaming. Fires were burning. And the most terrifying part? There were people running, stumbling, towards the camera in a disjointed, unnatural manner. Their faces were twisted in grotesque expressions of hunger, their eyes clouded with rage. Ethan's stomach dropped as the reality of what was happening set in. His first instinct was to call his mother, to make sure she was okay, but as he reached for his phone, the line went dead. Panic surged through him. He stepped outside to find the street eerily quiet, aside from the distant sirens wailing like wolves on the hunt. It wasn't long before he saw them. At first, it was just one person. A man stumbling down the sidewalk, his clothes torn, his skin pale and sickly. But then, Ethan saw more. A woman, her face a mask of horror as she charged toward an unsuspecting pedestrian, her mouth open wide in a gruesome snarl. Ethan froze. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear: these were not ordinary people. The screams of the woman's victim pierced the air as she dragged him to the ground. Ethan turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but the city he had once felt comfortable in was no longer a place of safety. It was a war zone, and the enemy was everywhere. By the time he reached his apartment building, chaos had completely erupted. The once bustling streets were now a maze of abandoned cars and panicked survivors running for their lives. A few brave souls tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed in seconds by the growing horde of attackers. The sounds of gunfire, screams, and the unmistakable growls of the undead filled the air. Ethan's apartment was on the 4th floor, and as he ascended the stairs, he caught sight of his neighbor, Mrs. Davis, at her window. She was clutching her dog, her face pale with fear. "Ethan, what's going on? What's happening out there?" she yelled, her voice trembling. He had no answer for her. No explanation for the nightmare unfolding before them. The best he could do was shake his head and keep moving. Inside his apartment, Ethan locked the door behind him and checked the windows. The streets were a blur of movement as the dead shuffled through the city, relentlessly searching for their next meal. It was hard to believe what he was seeing. He had heard rumors about pandemics and outbreaks before, but he never thought it could happen here, in his own city. Now, it seemed like the world was collapsing around him. Ethan paced the small living room, his thoughts racing. He needed a plan, a way to survive. But with the city already descending into madness, it was hard to know where to start. Should he leave? Where would he go? His phone was still useless, and the roads were blocked by debris and overturned cars. It didn't seem like help was coming. He grabbed a few essentials, a backpack, water, some granola bars, a flashlight, and shoved them into the bag. He didn't know how long he'd need to survive, but it was clear he couldn't stay in the apartment for long. As he moved toward the door, he paused, looking back at the only home he had known for years. The walls that had once offered him comfort now felt like a trap. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself. "You can do this." Ethan stepped outside once again, the sound of distant screams echoing in his ears. The world had changed in the span of a few hours. The city he once knew had turned into a jungle, and the only law was survival. In that moment, Ethan knew one thing for sure: the fight for his life was just beginning. He was trapped in a city overrun by the undead, and the only way out was to face the horrors that lay ahead. The next steps would determine whether he made it out alive, or became another victim of the horde. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped cautiously into the hallway of his apartment building, the walls now feeling like a suffocating cage. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the tense silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The world outside was a battleground, and he was about to plunge right into it. His mind was a storm of questions and doubts, but there was no time for hesitation. He couldn't afford to freeze. As he made his way down the stairs, every movement felt calculated. His ears were straining, listening for the telltale sounds of danger, the moans, the dragging footsteps, the feral growls of the undead. He couldn't see anything yet, but he knew they were close. The news reports and chaotic scenes he'd glimpsed earlier didn't even begin to convey the sheer terror of the situation. It was like the city had been invaded overnight, and the people were the first casualties of a war they hadn't even known was being fought. Ethan reached the bottom floor, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he felt the crushing weight of isolation. The familiar sounds of the street, cars honking, pedestrians chatting, the hum of everyday life, were gone. Now, all he could hear was the eerie quiet, punctuated by the occasional distant scream. The air felt thick with panic, as if it was waiting for the final spark to ignite the city into total destruction. He stepped outside into the narrow alleyway that ran along the side of his building, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any movement. The alley was abandoned, the trash cans knocked over and strewn about, and the faint smell of burning filled the air. There was no one in sight, but that didn't mean he was safe. Ethan knew better than to assume that. He'd already seen the twisted creatures that had once been human, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. He turned the corner cautiously and froze. Up ahead, two figures were shambling down the street. They moved erratically, their limbs jerking in unnatural ways. Ethan's stomach churned as he recognized them, not just as people, but as the horrors now roaming the city. One of them, a woman, had the remains of a bloody dress hanging off her bony frame, her face a mangled mask of death. Her eyes, once full of life, were now nothing but hollow sockets. The other, a man, was covered in dirt and grime, his shirt torn and his chest caved in as if he'd been struck by some invisible force. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. These were not survivors. These were predators. As the woman turned toward him, her head jerking unnaturally to one side, Ethan's instinct kicked in. He turned to move back into the alley, but the man saw him. The creature let out a low, guttural moan, and before Ethan could react, it lunged. The woman followed suit, her mouth open in a grotesque snarl, her teeth glinting in the dim light. The air crackled with panic as Ethan bolted down the alley. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but fear gave him strength. He could hear the rasping footsteps of the undead behind him, their speed unnerving despite their broken, unnatural gaits. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run faster, but his brain couldn't keep up with the panic. His heart thudded in his chest as he turned another corner, desperate to lose the creatures on his tail. But when he looked ahead, the alley was a dead end. Ethan cursed under his breath, his mind racing. There was no escape, he was trapped. He whirled around, his back pressed against the brick wall. The undead were closing in fast, the man stumbling with a ferocious hunger in his eyes, the woman screeching with every step. Their moans filled the narrow space, echoing like a death knell. Ethan's hand fumbled for the knife he had taken from his kitchen earlier. It felt small and useless in his grasp, but it was all he had. He could hear the creature's breath now, ragged and desperate, as they neared. He had no choice but to fight. His only hope was to take them down before they took him. The man was first, lunging at him with terrifying speed. Ethan dodged to the side, his heart racing. He swung the knife with all his strength, the blade sinking deep into the man's shoulder. The creature hissed, its face contorting in pain, but it didn't stop. Instead, it swung its arm at Ethan, knocking the knife from his grip and sending him sprawling onto the dirty pavement. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The woman was upon him now, her hands outstretched, fingers like claws reaching for his throat. Ethan's breathing became shallow as he scrambled to his feet, but the world felt like it was closing in. His mind was screaming, but his body was frozen in terror. Then, he saw it. A small piece of wood, lying in the debris at his feet. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed it, using it as a makeshift weapon. He swung the stick at the woman, hitting her across the face with a sickening crack. She staggered back, momentarily disoriented. He didn't hesitate, he drove the stick into her chest, the force of it knocking her to the ground. Breathing heavily, Ethan turned to face the man. The creature was still struggling to stand, its arm twitching uncontrollably. Ethan didn't wait for it to recover. He ran forward, picking up his knife from the ground, and with one swift motion, he plunged the blade deep into the creature's skull. The alley fell silent. Ethan stood over the two bodies, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of his first kill. He had survived, but just barely. The world had changed in an instant, and he had already learned the brutal truth: in this new world, there was no room for mercy. Survival was all that mattered. With trembling hands, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned away from the bodies, his mind already moving on to the next challenge. He couldn't afford to stop. Every second counted. And somewhere, out there, the rest of the city was waiting. Ethan's hands were still trembling as he continued to move through the wreckage of his city. His first encounter with the undead had been brutal and unrelenting, and the shock of it hadn't fully worn off. He kept replaying the fight in his mind, each moment flashing before him like a nightmare. He couldn't afford to dwell on it, though. The city was no longer the safe place it once was, and he had no illusions about how quickly it could all spiral out of control. As he navigated through the abandoned streets, Ethan began to form a plan. He needed to get out of the center of the city, away from the worst of the chaos. The further he was from the heart of the outbreak, the better his chances of survival. But where could he go? The roads were blocked by wrecked cars, abandoned buses, and shattered glass. He had no idea where the safest place might be, and without communication, he was entirely cut off from the rest of the world. He found a side street lined with old warehouses, their rusted doors hanging open. The area seemed relatively quiet compared to the madness that had consumed the main streets. He needed shelter, even if it was temporary. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city. Ethan knew he had limited time before the night came and the danger grew exponentially. Slipping into one of the warehouses, Ethan found an old metal staircase leading up to a second floor. The building was dark, and the air was thick with dust. He carefully made his way up the stairs, each creak of the metal under his weight sending a fresh wave of anxiety through him. At the top, he surveyed his surroundings. The floor was scattered with old crates and remnants of equipment long abandoned. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. He set down his backpack and sat on one of the crates, his back against the cold, damp wall. His mind was spinning with all the things he needed to do. How long would the city be in chaos? Was help coming, or was this the new reality? Could anyone be trusted out there? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but there was one thing he was sure of: he couldn't stay here for long. As he settled in, his thoughts began to drift back to his family. He had no way of knowing if they were okay, if they were still alive, or if they had become part of the horde. His mother, his younger sister Sarah, he had to find them. But finding his family in a city that had been overtaken by the undead was a daunting task. Every corner he turned was filled with dangers, and the thought of losing them, or worse, having to face them as one of the creatures, weighed heavily on his mind. His quiet moment was interrupted by a faint sound: footsteps. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps were slow, methodical, dragging against the floor. He slowly stood, his eyes scanning the shadows. The warehouse was large, the light dim, and the footsteps seemed to come from the far corner of the room. Ethan crept toward the edge of the warehouse, keeping his body low to the ground. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, hiding what could be lurking just beyond his vision. The last thing he needed was another confrontation with the undead, especially in such an open space. His hand wrapped tightly around the wooden stick he had used earlier, now splintered and weakened by the brutal encounter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all he had. He rounded a corner and froze again. Standing there in the dim light was another survivor, a man, tall and gaunt, wearing a dirty jacket and carrying a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. The man didn't seem to notice Ethan at first, too focused on something else in the corner of the room. Ethan took a cautious step forward. The man was alone. Was he hostile, or just another survivor trying to make it through this nightmare? In these circumstances, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he had to take the chance. If this man was armed or dangerous, Ethan wouldn't be able to survive on his own for long. "Hey!" Ethan called, his voice low but firm. The man spun around, his eyes wide with fear, his hands instinctively reaching for the duffel bag. Who are you?" he stammered. His voice was shaky, filled with the same panic that had overwhelmed Ethan only hours before. "Stay back. I have a weapon." Ethan raised his hands, showing the man he wasn't a threat. "I'm just looking for shelter," he said. "I don't want trouble. I'm just trying to survive." The man's expression softened, but only slightly. "Survive?" he scoffed. "I don't think anyone's gonna survive this. It's too late for that." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had heard the rumors, some survivors had already given up. They had stopped fighting, convinced that there was no hope left. The idea of giving up in the face of something so monstrous was hard for him to grasp, but the man's empty eyes told a different story. "I'm looking for my family," Ethan said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "My mom, my sister. I don't know where they are. Have you seen anyone? Anyone alive?" The man looked away, his gaze distant. "I've been here for days. Haven't seen anyone but them. It's just us now." Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. The thought of his family being out there, somewhere in the chaos, was unbearable. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let the city, or the undead, take everything from him. "Do you know if there's any safe place in the city?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, even though his mind was spinning with doubt. The man's eyes narrowed. "Safe place? There's no such thing anymore. But there's a group. I've heard rumors. They're holed up somewhere near the outskirts. You want to get there? You'll have to fight your way through." Ethan nodded. A group. A glimmer of hope in a city swallowed by darkness. But it wouldn't be easy. Every step forward would bring him closer to the unknown, and to the dangers that lay ahead. The struggle for survival wasn't over. It was just beginning. The man's words echoed in Ethan's mind as he tried to process the information. A group. A chance for survival. The thought of finding a sanctuary, even if it was only a rumor, was the first hopeful thing he had heard all day. But the reality set in quickly. To reach that group, he would have to fight his way through a city now overrun by the undead. Every inch of the way would be fraught with danger. The man, who introduced himself as Matt, was still eyeing Ethan cautiously, clearly hesitant to trust anyone. But in a world like this, trust was a currency no one could afford to give away easily. Ethan understood. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to survive. "I can help you get to the outskirts," Matt said, his voice low. "But you need to understand, it's not going to be easy. The city's fallen apart. The zombies, they're everywhere. You've seen that already." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing through the steps of his plan. He couldn't waste time. Every minute spent here in the warehouse was another minute the undead had to close in on him. He needed to move, now. "Do you have a way out of here?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. Matt pointed toward the back of the warehouse. "There's a back door. It leads to an alleyway that's usually clear. At least, it was this morning." Ethan grabbed his backpack and stood. His body was sore from the fight earlier, and the exhaustion from the constant adrenaline rush weighed heavily on him. But there was no time for fatigue. If he wanted to make it out alive, he needed to keep moving. The two men crept toward the back of the warehouse, their footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The shadows seemed to grow longer as the sun dipped lower, casting an ominous gloom over everything. Ethan's senses were on high alert. Every creak of the building, every distant groan from the street outside, set his nerves on edge. They reached the back door, and Matt pushed it open slowly, the rusty hinges protesting in a low groan. The alley outside was deserted, just as he had said. But that didn't mean it was safe. Ethan knew better than to assume that. He scanned the street, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. "This way," Matt whispered, leading him through the alley. Ethan followed closely behind, his footsteps careful and deliberate. The streets were eerily quiet as they moved, the usual bustle of city life now replaced by the unsettling sounds of destruction. Far off in the distance, Ethan could hear the faint echo of screams and growls, signals of the chaos that had consumed the city. They moved quickly but cautiously, sticking to the narrow side streets and avoiding the main roads. Ethan's mind was racing as he thought about his family, wondering if they were still alive, wondering if they had made it out. The thought gnawed at him, but he forced himself to focus on the present. He couldn't afford distractions. Not now. The two men reached the edge of a neighborhood that bordered the city's outskirts. The houses here were older, more run down, their windows boarded up and the lawns overgrown. It was quiet, too quiet. "This is where we part ways," Matt said, stopping abruptly. "I'm heading toward the industrial park on the other side of town. There's a safe house there, if I can make it." Ethan paused, looking at Matt. The man's face was pale, his eyes hollow, like someone who had already given up. But Ethan couldn't afford to be kind. He needed information, not sympathy. "Where exactly is this group you're talking about?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone even. Matt hesitated, looking over his shoulder nervously before speaking. "There's a church, St. James. The survivors are holed up there. You might make it, if you're lucky. But you'll need to be careful. The zombies tend to congregate around the areas with the most noise. The church is on the other side of town, closer to the river." Ethan's mind raced as he processed the information. The church. It seemed like a safe enough place to head, but the thought of crossing the city's ruins to get there was daunting. The undead were everywhere, and moving through the heart of the chaos would be a test of endurance and wit. "Thanks," Ethan said, although he wasn't sure Matt would make it to his destination. The man's eyes were clouded with defeat, and the distance between them felt like the gap between life and death. Matt nodded and turned, disappearing into the shadows of the street. Ethan watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the path ahead. The church was his goal now. The thought of finding his family, of being among other survivors, was the only thing keeping him going. As Ethan made his way toward the outskirts, the city grew quieter, but that only made him more cautious. It was too still, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. He moved swiftly through the streets, his senses alert to every creak, every whisper of wind. The path ahead was filled with uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. And then, just as he reached a street corner, he heard it. The unmistakable shuffle of feet. The low, guttural growl of someone, moving through the darkness. Ethan pressed himself flat against a wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The street was empty, but he could hear them, more of the undead. Their footsteps were heavy, dragging, but unmistakable. He peered around the corner, his breath caught in his throat. 3 figures staggered into view, their disjointed movements like a twisted dance. They were close, too close. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He needed to get past them, but how? The alley behind him was a dead end, and the street ahead was wide open. His mind raced, and his eyes darted around the street, looking for any cover. There! A dumpster behind a building. If he could make it there, he might be able to hide long enough for them to pass. Taking a deep breath, Ethan crouched low and sprinted, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was so close to his goal, so close to the church. He couldn't let this be the end. He reached the dumpster and crouched behind it, holding his breath. The undead shuffled closer, their ragged breaths growing louder. Ethan felt his heart in his throat, praying they wouldn't notice him. The world seemed to slow, the shadows growing longer, the tension unbearable. Then, as if by some miracle, the creatures passed, their minds focused on something else. Ethan waited until he could no longer hear their footsteps, then emerged from his hiding spot, a new sense of resolve in his chest. He had made it through this first obstacle, but he knew there would be many more to come. The journey to the church would be long, and the risks would be great. But he couldn't stop now. The survivors were out there, and so was his family. Ethan pressed forward, determined to survive, whatever it took. Ethan's pace quickened as he moved away from the alley, but the danger wasn't behind him. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, and the streets stretched out in front of him like an endless maze of destruction. The church Matt had mentioned was on the other side of the city, near the river. Getting there would mean crossing through even more dangerous areas, but the thought of other survivors, of a safe place, kept pushing him forward. The sun had now fully set, leaving only the faint glow of streetlights casting an eerie orange hue on the crumbling streets. Ethan's stomach growled, reminding him that food was another thing in short supply. But he didn't dare stop to look for supplies. The longer he stayed in one place, the higher the chances of attracting the undead. As he moved cautiously along the street, Ethan kept to the shadows, his steps light and deliberate. The occasional sound of distant growls and shrieks reminded him of the danger that lurked around every corner. The world had changed. What had once been a bustling city was now a desolate wasteland, and the undead were its only true rulers. Ethan's thoughts drifted to his family again. His mother and sister, where were they? Were they even alive? His last memory of them was a frantic phone call, just before the outbreak reached its peak. He had promised them he would find them, but the city had transformed overnight. Finding them seemed impossible now. But he couldn't give up on that promise. He couldn't let the world swallow them whole. After an hour of moving through the wreckage of the city, Ethan reached a familiar landmark, the bridge over the river. The once thriving area near the water had been reduced to rubble. The water below was murky, swirling with debris from the chaos that had unfolded. It was quiet now, almost too quiet. The bridge itself was cracked and unstable, but it was still standing. Ethan stepped onto the bridge cautiously, his heart pounding with each footstep. The structure groaned under his weight, and every step felt like a risk. He had no choice but to cross. The river could be a barrier between him and the undead, but the bridge was the only way to get closer to the church and the potential for safety. Halfway across, Ethan froze. A low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness below, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet. He peered over the edge of the bridge, and his blood ran cold. A group of zombies had gathered near the riverbank, their bodies half submerged in the water. Their vacant eyes scanned the area, and their growls filled the air. Ethan cursed under his breath. There was no way he could go back the way he came, not with those creatures below him. He stood still, hoping that the undead wouldn't notice him. The creatures seemed oblivious to his presence at first, their attention focused on the distant sounds of the city. But as one of them turned and looked directly at him, Ethan's heart stopped. The creature let out a low hiss, its jaws snapping in a grotesque motion. And then, just like that, the rest of them turned, their eyes locking onto him. Ethan didn't wait to see if they would move closer. He knew they would. Without a second thought, he bolted down the bridge, running as fast as he could. The old structure seemed to tremble under the force of his footsteps, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Behind him, the zombies began to shuffle in pursuit, their broken legs dragging them across the uneven ground. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the end of the bridge. He leapt over the final gap, landing hard on the cracked pavement. The zombies were right behind him, but the space between them was growing. He kept running, not looking back. He didn't have time to think, to worry about the aching in his legs or the stitch in his side. All that mattered was getting to the church. He had no idea what he would find when he got there, but he couldn't afford to stop. As he neared the riverbank, he could see the faint outline of the church in the distance. It was only a few blocks away now, but that meant nothing. In this city, nothing was certain. Ethan turned a corner, weaving through abandoned cars and overturned streetlights, his eyes scanning for any movement. The streets seemed to be getting quieter as he neared his goal. Maybe the undead had already taken over the other parts of the city. Maybe the silence was their warning to him. But then he saw it, movement in the distance. A small group of survivors was huddled together by an old convenience store. They were gathering supplies, moving cautiously between the shelves. Their eyes flicked nervously to the street, aware of the threat that lurked just beyond their line of sight. Ethan's heart leapt. There were people alive out here. He was about to approach them when something caught his attention. A zombie, one that had clearly been following the group, stepped into the street, its eyes glazed over and its mouth hanging open in a grotesque snarl. It was moving toward the survivors. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. He could help them. They would need to get rid of the zombie if they were going to stay safe. He didn't know if they would welcome him, but in a world where survival was a constant fight, every hand that extended could be a lifeline. With a quick decision, Ethan moved forward, taking cover behind an abandoned vehicle. He grabbed a long piece of metal debris from the ground and readied himself. His pulse was racing. He had to act fast. The zombie was getting closer, and the survivors hadn't noticed yet. They were too focused on gathering what they could. Ethan crouched low, staying out of sight. He watched as the zombie grew nearer, its footsteps dragging against the cracked pavement. Without warning, he leapt from behind the car, charging at the creature. The metal piece in his hand connected with the zombie's skull with a sickening crunch. The creature crumpled to the ground, its body twitching before falling still. The survivors turned at the sound of the impact, eyes wide in shock. Ethan stood over the fallen zombie, his breath coming in heavy gasps. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse from running. The survivors hesitated, exchanging wary glances before one of them, a man in his mid-30s, stepped forward. He was tall, with a thick beard and a grim expression. "Who are you?" the man asked, his tone cautious. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, standing up straight. "I'm looking for a group of survivors. The church, near the river. Do you know it?" The man's face softened. "We know the place. We're heading that way too. You should come with us. It's safer in numbers." Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. This was the break he had been hoping for, the chance to make it to safety, to find others who were still fighting to survive. As they set off together, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. The journey wasn't over yet, but maybe, just maybe, he was one step closer to finding safety, and his family. The group of survivors moved cautiously through the streets, keeping their heads low and their eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of danger. Ethan's heart was still racing from the close call with the zombie, but the presence of others brought a strange sense of relief. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in days, he had someone to rely on, even if only for the moment. The man who had spoken to him earlier, Daniel, led the way, keeping a firm grip on a crowbar. The others followed closely behind him, 2 women and another man. They moved in a tight formation, their steps synchronized as if they had been working together for a long time. Despite the outward calm, Ethan could see the tension in their faces. Every corner they turned, every door they passed, held the potential for an ambush, and they knew it. "Where are you from?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. "Before all this, before everything went to hell." Ethan hesitated for a moment. It felt strange to talk about the world that was, about the normality that seemed like a distant dream. He glanced around at the faces of the group. They had all lost something. They had all experienced the same devastation. I was with my family. "We were in the city when it happened," Ethan said quietly, his voice faltering as the memories flooded back. "I don't know what happened to them. I couldn't find them." Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "I know what that feels like. We all lost someone. But right now, it's about survival. We can't go back to the past. Not until we're safe." Ethan nodded in agreement, swallowing the lump in his throat. He couldn't think about his family too much, he couldn't afford to. There was too much at stake now. His survival depended on moving forward, not looking back. As they continued down the deserted streets, the once bustling city seemed like a ghost town. Shops were looted, cars abandoned, and buildings that had once been symbols of life were now crumbling monuments to a world that no longer existed. The occasional screech of a distant zombie broke the stillness, reminding them that danger was never far away. They reached a corner, and Daniel held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. Ethan crouched down beside him, peeking around the corner to see what lay ahead. The street was eerily quiet. But in the distance, he saw them, more zombies. A group of about 5 or 6 were scattered along the street, shuffling aimlessly, their heads turned at odd angles. They didn't appear to be aware of the survivors' presence yet, but Ethan knew that could change in an instant. "We need to take the back route," Daniel whispered, pointing to an alleyway just past the zombies. "There's a narrow street that leads directly to the church. It'll be safer than going through the main road." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on the undead figures. Their vacant eyes and jerky movements sent a chill down his spine. The thought of facing them in close quarters was enough to make him break into a cold sweat. But he didn't have a choice. The church was close, and he had to make it there. "We move fast, and we stick together," Daniel instructed. "If any of them notice us, don't hesitate. We fight and run." The group nodded, tightening their grip on whatever weapons they had. Ethan's hands felt clammy as he adjusted the strap of his backpack. He had no weapon other than the knife he had taken from the warehouse, but it would have to do. There was no time for hesitation. They crept through the alley, staying low and moving silently. The sound of their footsteps seemed deafening in the otherwise quiet street. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced through all the ways things could go wrong. He couldn't stop thinking about the zombies. About how close they were. How they could turn in any direction and find them. The alley was narrow, and as they passed the back of an old building, Ethan heard a sound. A distant moan, then a shuffle of feet. His pulse quickened, and he shot a glance back at the others. Daniel motioned for them to keep going. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan moved faster, his body tensing with every step. The alley twisted and turned, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were making good progress. But then, just as they rounded the corner, they saw it. A barricade. A pile of debris, broken furniture, and metal bars blocked their path. It looked like someone had tried to fortify the alley, but now it was just an obstacle they couldn't get around. "We're stuck," one of the women, Emily, whispered, her voice tight with panic. "What do we do now?" Daniel's eyes scanned the barricade quickly, his brow furrowing in frustration. "There has to be a way through," he muttered under his breath. "We don't have time to turn back." Ethan's mind raced. The church was so close, just a few more blocks away. But this barricade, it was a wall they couldn't ignore. There were no easy ways around it, and the zombies were still out there. He moved forward, inspecting the debris. His fingers brushed over a rusty metal rod, and an idea sparked. "If we move this stuff around, we might be able to create a gap wide enough to squeeze through. But it's going to take time." Daniel nodded. "We don't have a lot of time before the zombies notice us. But we don't have a choice. Let's do it." The group got to work quickly, each person grabbing whatever they could to move the debris. The clattering noise echoed down the alley, making Ethan's nerves fray. They were so close to being surrounded. One wrong move, and they could all be overrun. As they moved the last of the rubble, the sound of distant shuffling grew louder. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the undead coming closer. The smell of decay was on the air. "Just a little more," Daniel said through clenched teeth, his muscles straining as he pushed a large metal crate aside. "We're almost through." Ethan glanced back, his eyes darting to the street. The first zombie appeared at the far end of the alley, its jerky movements just visible in the dim light. It was coming closer. "We need to move, now!" Ethan shouted, his voice urgent. The group pushed the last of the debris aside, creating just enough of a gap to squeeze through. One by one, they scrambled through the opening, Ethan the last to go. His chest felt tight as he pulled himself through the narrow space, barely avoiding the snapping jaws of a nearby zombie that had caught up with them. They made it to the other side, but the danger wasn't over. The church was still a few blocks away, and the undead were closing in. With no time to waste, Daniel led them forward, urging them to move as quickly as possible. The church was their last hope. And Ethan wasn't about to let anything stop him now. The narrow street ahead was illuminated only by the dim glow of flickering streetlights, casting long shadows against the crumbling buildings. The survivors were exhausted, but there was no room for slowing down. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, the church that might hold the refuge they so desperately needed. Ethan's legs burned from running, but the adrenaline still surged through his veins, pushing him forward. Behind them, the sounds of the undead grew louder. The creatures, relentless and hungry, had found the barricade they'd left behind, and now they were swarming toward the alley. There was no time to waste. The survivors were being hunted, and the church was the only chance they had. Daniel led the way, his crowbar raised and ready for anything that might jump out at them. The rest of the group followed closely, staying in formation. Emily was keeping a firm grip on a large knife, while the other man, Sean, carried an old baseball bat. Their faces were tense, their eyes darting around as they moved cautiously. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could hear the familiar shuffle of the zombies closing in from behind, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep moving. The thought of being trapped out here, exposed, was too much to bear. The church wasn't just a place of safety, it was a symbol of hope, and it was the only thing keeping him from losing it all. As they rounded a corner, the outline of the church came into view. It was a small, old building, its white walls now covered in grime and dirt. The front doors stood open, as if beckoning them in. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. They had made it this far, but they were far from safe. "We have to hurry," Daniel muttered, his voice low but firm. "Get inside, quickly." They broke into a sprint, pushing themselves harder as they neared the church. The sound of growls and shuffles was now deafening. The undead were close. They could hear their ragged breathing, their gurgles of hunger. Just as they reached the doors, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Ethan didn't look back, but the urgency in the others' faces told him everything he needed to know. The zombies had arrived. "Get in!" Daniel shouted. The survivors poured into the church, their breaths ragged and shallow. Ethan was the last to enter, and as he shoved the door shut behind him, he could feel the first hands of the undead reaching for him. The door slammed against their bodies, and for a moment, all was still. Inside the church, the air was thick with dust and silence. The flickering light from the street lamps outside cast long shadows across the pews and stained glass windows. The church, once a place of peace and refuge, now felt like a tomb, abandoned, forsaken, and filled with the memories of a world long gone. Ethan quickly surveyed the interior. The church seemed undisturbed, though the air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. There was no sign of other survivors, but the place was clearly in disrepair. The floor was cracked, and the wooden pews had been overturned. Still, it was a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. Daniel quickly moved to the front of the church, checking the windows and securing the doors. The others took a moment to catch their breath, leaning against the pews or crouching in exhaustion. Ethan stood near the back, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through him. He hadn't fully processed what had just happened, the chase, the narrow escape, but there was no time to think about it. They were safe, for now. "What now?" Emily asked, her voice shaky but determined. "We're in here, but what happens next?" Daniel paused, his back turned to the group as he surveyed the church's interior. "We rest, regroup, and figure out our next move. But we need to stay quiet. We don't know how long we can stay here before the zombies find a way in." Ethan nodded. He understood. There was no guarantee that the church would remain safe for long. The undead were persistent, and once they caught wind of fresh survivors, they would keep coming, never stopping. "We'll need to barricade the doors," Sean said, his voice hoarse. "We'll use whatever we can find." Daniel turned, his expression hard. "Do it," We need to make sure this place is secure. If they get inside, we're all dead. The group got to work quickly, moving around the church and gathering what they could. They piled pews against the doors, stacked chairs, and anything else they could find. The sound of shuffling feet outside the church door grew louder with each passing second. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he moved a piece of broken wood into place. He could feel his heart racing again, that familiar knot of fear tightening in his chest. But they were here. They had made it inside. And that meant they had a fighting chance. As the last door was barricaded, Daniel took a step back and surveyed their work. This should hold for now. We can't stay here forever, but we'll figure something out. Ethan didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the family he'd left behind. His mother, his sister, he couldn't stop the thoughts from swirling in his head. What if they were out there, alone, facing the same dangers? What if they were dead? Ethan? He snapped out of his thoughts and looked toward Daniel, who was standing by the window, peering out into the darkness. The others were gathered around, waiting for him to respond. You good? Daniel asked, his voice low. Ethan nodded, forcing a small smile. Yeah. Just trying to keep it together. Daniel didn't push further. He simply gave him a knowing look before turning back to the group. We'll rest for the night, Daniel said, his voice calm but resolute. In the morning, we'll figure out our next move. But right now, we survive. Ethan watched as the group settled into their positions, finding places to rest, albeit uneasily. The church may have offered temporary safety, but Ethan knew this wouldn't last forever. They couldn't stay hidden here forever. They would have to keep moving, keep searching for other survivors, and face the horrors of the world outside. But for the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself a moment of peace. They were safe, for now. Tomorrow would come with its own set of challenges, but tonight, they had one. And that was enough. As Ethan lay on the cold floor, his mind slowly drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by the image of the city he once knew, now overtaken by the undead. And in the distance, he could hear the faint echo of the monsters still hunting. But for tonight, they were safe. The church was silent when Ethan awoke. The faint light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the dusty floor. His body ached from the tension of the previous night, and the weight of what was ahead pressed on him like a heavy burden. He knew that the temporary safety the church had provided was fleeting. The world outside was still overrun by the undead, and the horde wouldn't be far behind. He rubbed his eyes and slowly sat up, feeling the cool floor beneath him. The others were stirring as well, their movements quiet and cautious. There was no need for words, everyone knew what had to be done. The barricades would only hold for so long, and the longer they stayed, the more likely they were to attract the attention of the zombies. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice steady but tired. We can't stay here forever. The zombies are still out there, and this place won't protect us much longer. We need to make a plan. Ethan stood, stretching his stiff muscles. The adrenaline from the previous day was gone, replaced with the exhaustion that only survival in a world like this could bring. Still, he pushed the weariness aside. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. Emily and Sean were sitting near the back of the church, packing up their meager belongings. Their faces were haggard, worn down by the horrors they had witnessed. Ethan could see it in their eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. Everyone was struggling to hold it together, but they couldn't let their guard down. Not now. Ethan took a deep breath, walking toward Daniel. What's the plan? Daniel's eyes met his, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The weight of the question hung in the air. There were no guarantees anymore. No perfect solutions. Just survival. The look in Daniel's eyes was all too familiar, a mix of determination and dread. He had made it this far, but there was no telling what lay ahead. We head for the outskirts of the city, Daniel said quietly. There's a chance we might find other survivors there, or at least some supplies. We don't have much left in the way of food or water, and if we stay here much longer, we'll run out of options. Ethan nodded, his mind racing through the possibilities. The outskirts of the city might be their best shot, but it wasn't without risk. The closer they got to the city's edge, the more open they would be to attacks, and the more zombies they would encounter. But there was no alternative. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. He glanced back at the others. Emily and Sean had finished packing, their bags slung over their shoulders. Their faces were grim, but they were ready to move. Everyone knew what they had to do. There was no turning back now. "Let's do it," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We've made it this far. We can make it through this too." Daniel gave him a nod, his expression resolute. "All right. We'll move out in 15 minutes. Get your gear, and don't forget to check your weapons." The group quickly gathered their belongings, checking and rechecking their weapons. Ethan's knife was still strapped to his waist, its dull blade a constant reminder of how ill-prepared he was for what lay ahead. But it was all he had, and he had learned to make do with less. The air outside was heavy with the scent of decay. The city was eerily quiet, but Ethan knew that the silence wouldn't last long. The zombies were always nearby, lurking in the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. They moved quickly and quietly through the church's back entrance, stepping into the abandoned alley behind the building. The sun had just begun to rise, casting an orange glow over the wreckage of the city. It was a strange, unsettling beauty, a reminder of how quickly everything had been lost. As they made their way through the streets, the group kept their heads low, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The city had become a dangerous maze of abandoned vehicles, overturned trash bins, and decaying buildings. The occasional groan or distant growl sent shivers down their spines, but they pressed on, determined to stay one step ahead of the undead. Ethan's mind raced as he walked, his thoughts shifting between the mission at hand and the constant nagging question of what had happened to his family. He couldn't shake the image of his mother and sister, lost in the chaos. He had to believe they were still out there. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for them too. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached the outskirts of the city. The once bustling streets now looked like a war zone, filled with wreckage and destruction. The buildings here were fewer and farther between, their skeletal remains towering over the empty roads. Daniel stopped in the middle of the street, signaling for the group to halt. "We need to find shelter," he said quietly. "Keep your eyes open. We don't know what we'll encounter out here." Ethan nodded and scanned the area. There was a large, run-down gas station a few blocks away, its sign barely legible. It was as good a place as any to search for supplies. The group moved cautiously toward it, keeping a close watch on their surroundings. As they approached the station, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet reached their ears. The unmistakable moans of the undead echoed through the empty streets. They weren't alone. "There's a group of them," Sean whispered, his hand tightening around his bat. "They're between us and the station." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The last thing they needed was a direct confrontation with a horde. But they didn't have much choice. The station was close, and they needed the supplies inside. "We'll have to fight our way through," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. "Stay close, and stay focused." They tightened their grip on their weapons, prepared for the worst. Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the first of the zombies emerged from around the corner, a grotesque figure with its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, its flesh hanging loosely from its bones. The rest of the horde was close behind, their dead eyes locked onto the survivors. The fight for survival had come to this, an all-out battle for their lives. And as the first zombie lunged toward them, Ethan's heart raced. He could only hope they were ready for the challenge ahead.